The Brussels Report podcast.
Welcome to this new episode of the Brussels Report podcast. My name is Pieter Cleppe, and I'm very happy to have with me today as my guest Philip Weiss, who's the director of ZN Consulting. So welcome, Philip.
Glad to be here.
So in terms of introducing you, you have 3 passports: Belgian, German, British. Connection with India as well, as I understand, through your wife. But the reason I invite you here is because you have 25 years of experience in the Brussels EU policy bubble, right?
Absolutely.
And you have a special focus on digital communication.
Yep.
So I don't think I have to explain to listeners that digital communication has become a lot more important, but specifically focused on EU policy. Could you tell a bit more about that? The importance of Twitter, all these channels today that are basically driving the conversation, as opposed to when you started 25 years ago?
Yeah, I think we need to understand the traditional model of lobbying and communication in Brussels, which was very technocratic. I think traditionally people came with a policy file, a dossier, and they would say, these are the things that we plan to do. And you had different organizations representing different interests that tried to influence the way this dossier was constructed and to make their case and to shape that policy file. Now, I think over the last 10, 15 years, people have started to understand that if you do that behind the scenes, if you're talking only to the officials in the European Commission, in the Parliament, and around that, you basically might completely fail. Even though you might win the argument, there might be an NGO that goes out and makes a much bigger impact because they communicate and they tell a story about why this policy is wrong and why people need to oppose it. And what I think people have started to realize, and it's taken a long time, is that policy without communication is a huge risk, because it means that you might actually lose the entire argument that you're trying to make because you forgot to connect it to the outside world and you forgot to tell a story with a strong emotional component.
Yeah, that strikes me as absolutely correct. And I mean, for example, if you look at the Green Deal, the outgoing von der Leyen Commission has issued a lot of regulation and policies, and I would argue personally that specifically the green NGOs have been very successful in doing just that, whereas industry, that is often on the receiving side here of the regulation, they seem to be very shy, very afraid to basically speak up and make their case.
Yeah, I think this is, and especially when you talk about something like the Green Deal, which is a very complex piece of legislation which covers a whole range of different areas and activities. If you want to have an impact, whether you're an NGO or your industry, you need to say, okay, this is the area where I want to raise awareness. I need to tell people that there's a problem with this specific thing, and I need to make that clear, not just to the people that I'm negotiating with, but also to a wider audience. And I think this is a skill that's been lacking in Brussels and in the EU, which is, good communication skills. How do you tell a simple story out of a very complex policy file, and how do you then bring the stakeholders, bring the influencers that might help you to make that case? So for me, going back to your question about what happened over the last 25 years, I think there has been a gradual realization that was important, followed by a realization that this was missing as a skill in most of these teams that were developing policy or trying to influence legislation. And that's, here we're talking about traditional communication, but of course at the same time, communication has moved online and has changed structure. So you're talking about saying, how do we tell the story? How do we use these new channels, be it X, LinkedIn, email, a combination of all these messages with a different kind of story? And I think that's really been my takeaway. But I do now have much more open conversations with people where I think, there's a realization that this is very important, but it's still at early stages of being implemented.
Yeah, very interesting. And ZN, your consultancy, is quite well known in the Brussels bubble for its annual ranking of EU influencers, and I'm very proud myself and honored that I've been included. Now, could you tell me a bit more on sort of how do you come up with this ranking, the criteria you use?
Yeah, so we started this 8 years ago, which I think is quite interesting because, again, we're talking about almost a decade. And when we started, we wanted to say, look...
That's BC, before COVID.
Absolutely. And it was when Twitter was the dominant channel. So actually our ranking started only on Twitter. And what we wanted to say is, look, there are people in Brussels, in the EU, that are having quite an impact on these conversations. They use these channels. They might be experts like yourselves. They might be journalists. They might be scientists. They might be policymakers. But we wanted to highlight their importance. So we went on Twitter and used a number of different tools and said, okay, let's see who has the biggest footprint. They have followers, so let's look at that follower count. Let's look at how many retweets each of their tweets gets. And we added criteria like, do they get retweeted by MEPs? Do they get retweeted in Brussels, in the EU kind of space? So we've mixed different criteria to try to get a balance, and I think we've got it right. It's of course never a perfect exercise, but what we're doing is we're saying, look, there are people doing some very interesting and useful communication work, and we want to emphasize that, and we want to recognize the people doing that work, and then that's why we do the ranking. But it's really all about saying, look, here are people that are worth following if you're interested in these topics, because they're putting a lot of work into it and they are being listened to. So in reality, that means that they impact the conversation. And if you impact the conversation, you start shaping it.
Yeah, I mean, instinctively, I think this is so true. I mean, especially Twitter, I think you feel like this has become the marketplace of ideas. But then, I'm told that in certain countries, it's bizarre, like Sweden, Twitter apparently does not seem to play a big role politically.
Yeah, I think, in Brussels, traditionally it was Twitter or X that was the hub of the political conversation. Today, this is being challenged. Basically by the uncertainty around the channel and also by the political move. Essentially now it's seen as a political tool owned by Elon Musk with a very specific objective. I think it makes a lot of people in the EU uncomfortable, but as we saw in our last event this September, this is still the dominant channel. MEPs are still using it as their primary channel. When Thierry Breton resigned, he announced it on X, despite being, one of the critics of the platform. So, yes, it is the core platform, but for the moment, it's becoming far more fragmented, the whole landscape. So you're seeing a lot of migration towards LinkedIn. In the room, when we did a kind of show of hands, we asked people, which is the channel that you use the most? People were actually talking about LinkedIn. But what I believe is that we're now just seeing a fragmentation, and it can be LinkedIn for one conversation, X for another. And as you mentioned, in different countries, they use different channels. In some countries, Facebook will still be a very popular channel. We're seeing Instagram emerge as a new platform where discussions around climate change, and as you said, the Green Deal might start being more engaged on those platforms. So each policy area might have a kind of best channel, and you have all these micro niches and these very specific topics. And sometimes you say, okay, well, if I want to follow a conversation about transportation and rail, I might need to go to Mastodon because that's where John Worth is spending all his time. That as a specific example, he's a critic of X. And on other topics, you might want to go to another platform. So I think it's become very complicated. Our ranking has accommodated these changes. So now, we're trying to look at all the different platforms and give different judgments. But it's all about understanding where the conversation is moving and what you as a communicator and as a policymaker you should focus on.
And if I can pick a few channels, like let's start maybe with Facebook. You mentioned that in some countries it's still popular, meaning in many countries it has gone down in importance, or at least that's my reading. Is that the case? Well,
Facebook is quite complicated. I mean, it is still the dominant channel globally. It has the most follower base. Now, it's more of a mainstream channel. On the other hand, for policy people like us, they have tried to discourage political conversation, which makes it a little bit difficult because you get punished if you're talking too much about overtly political topics, especially around the election. So your posts can get downgraded. The adverts might require a lot of approvals and might be rejected. So it's there for, I would say, entertainment, for connection. And we've worked a lot on healthcare and vaccination, for example, and in some countries that was still by far the space where people were engaging. We have a doctor in Romania who has over 300,000 followers on Facebook and is communicating on science-based information around vaccination. And in another country, Instagram might be the right place to do it. So when you're doing your strategy and you want to look at different countries, you have to really benchmark where the conversation is, where the channels are. And, that's for the next 3 to 6 months because it might change again. TikTok might become the right space, or Instagram, or even it could still be Twitter in a specific area or niche.
And maybe, let's talk about TikTok, because that's what you often hear, that young people until 25 years old, this has become the internet for them. It's not only the channel where they learn all kinds of reliable or less reliable things, but it's also a tool that they use instead of Google to look up stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, what was very interesting in the EU influencer event is we had several TikTok influencers, including a journalist who is a teacher of journalism who talks about Europe on TikTok, and quite successfully. We also had a contribution from Enrique, who was also the Reuters Thomson Foundation TikTok journalist. And again, you wouldn't expect them, because they were kind of experienced journalists, to be using it, but they use it not just on the side, but actually also formally. So I think, again, TikTok is emerging as a new channel. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty even around TikTok, because who knows what, it's been banned in India. It could be banned in the US. It depends on the administration. It depends on a number of different things. But it's what you're saying is absolutely true. It's critical for young people. What's interesting about these channels is that the more they become mainstream, the more they start changing in terms of content because of the audience that starts living there. Facebook started as a student network. Then it moved into a kind of more mainstream, but it was a young people's network, and now it's almost like an old people's network for your parents or even your grandparents. So it's very important to realize that if the channel becomes more and more important, it will change the way it's perceived and the way it's used. But yes, TikTok is very popular with young people. And I think what it's doing is it's changing the way other channels communicate. Everybody is trying to do video better, being influenced by the way TikTok videos are created and kind of deployed.
And maybe to finish up, let's discuss maybe Telegram. So Telegram is not just like a messaging service like WhatsApp. It also, as I understand, allows people to broadcast their message to thousands of people. So it effectively functions as some kind of a semi-public social network or broadcasting tool. And it seems to be used by, let's say, the less savory sides of the political spectrum, Russian military bloggers, Islamist terrorist sympathizers. But it does seem to have an influence. It does seem to have the capacity to radicalize people also here in Western Europe. So yeah, what to think of that particular channel?
Well, I think architecturally it's similar to WhatsApp. You can do groups on WhatsApp. You can publish information, and it has a kind of degree of privacy. Now, what Telegram has marketed itself as is a no censorship, absolute free speech, no government intervention. As you know, that led to the arrest, or at least the temporary detention of the CEO. And I think, sorry?
Pavel Durov.
Absolutely. Now, the point is that these platforms like Telegram are going to have to accept that they operate in the real world, and governments simply might not accept and do not accept that they can do whatever they want, and any kind of content moderation is never going to happen. And I think we're going to see that with Telegram, because eventually they just get banned if they don't accept that's kind of government intervention, or as some might call it, censorship. Now, the thing to remember is that these channels are essentially apps on the internet, but the internet has always had multiplicity of channels, and you always had different levels of, let's say, unsavory channel. You still have 4chan, you have anonymous forums where you can have all sorts of, very scary, very disturbing content, because the nature of the internet makes that very difficult to stop altogether. But then we have the platforms that we hear about, and as they acquire size and scale and money, then they can be, managed and controlled by governments. So I don't think that the governments will continue to try to regulate the channels, but on the other hand, you will always have other spaces on the internet where, people can find ways to communicate through encryption and other things. So again, I think what we need to understand is that the internet is a constantly evolving space where channels come and go. But because it's so important today, it has become mainstream. And so governments are saying we cannot let something that important go completely unregulated. The same we saw of the media when it emerged at the beginning of last century.
Mm-hmm. Yes, let's maybe to sum up then go into a number of examples where it became clear that you need communications for policy. So let's take Brexit, for example, a topic I've been extensively focused on. Do you think that chances were missed there to sort of improve policy by communication?
Yeah, I think it's a textbook example. It's also obviously exceptional because of the historical significance of Brexit. But what's very clear, for example, is that the UK government was very focused on an internal conversation. A lot of the communication that was coming out of the UK government was really aimed at a specific section of the public and of the Tory party, and really they struggled to adjust their message to an EU audience when they were negotiating, because those messages might resonate well with the media in the UK that was saying, okay, let's challenge the EU, but this was completely counterproductive when it came to the EU. And what they should have done is to try to find a conversation that essentially connected to an EU audience, and at the same time they were able to communicate to their to the home audience. I'm not sure that was possible, because there were a lot of promises that that they made during Brexit, which just you could not kind of square that circle. But I think that their communication outside the UK was catastrophic, especially Boris Johnson, and I think the tensions within the Tory party were the main problem they had, because they couldn't communicate anything that wouldn't immediately lead to destabilization of the government. So I think it's an extreme case. I think that if you look at cases like TTIP, where essentially there was a lot of consensus at the beginning of the policy conversation, but then I think a lack of communication, a lack of proactive communication from industry to really say, look, this is a good thing for our industry, but also for the European economy as a whole, and they failed to do that. So as a result of that, politicians found themselves having to advocate for something, and NGOs started to say, this is terrible, this is wrong, here are all the problems, and there wasn't a counter. And I think this is, in part, TTIP was the victim of the absence of communication around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the same with a number of other, and like it was all about chickens that would come from the States that would be sub quality, and also with Brexit, I agree. Like I used to work for this British think tank, Open Europe, and we were always in favor of trying to reform the club in order to keep the British in the club. And one of the things that we told the British government is, look, there's actually so many aspects of British criticism towards the EU that many people in mainland Europe agree with. So the UK government should try to exploit that and make their case to the pan-European public. And they did try that to a degree, but not really that strong. The temptation was always to play for their own gallery, of course, their national politicians. And interestingly, a similar thing happens every time there's an EU summit. You can see the leaders coming out and giving, statements to their national media. But then sometimes, if you then, sometimes these statements may not come across as well with other audiences in other countries. For example, if the Italian Prime Minister or the Spanish Prime Minister would say, look, we secured a lot more from EU budget, well, that's not going to be received well in the Netherlands, where people are typically relatively hostile to having to spend more and pay more into the EU budget. So that's a good example, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the other issue is that, this comes from a mindset where you have national media that's completely separated.
Yes.
And I think that has changed. And the internet, of course, is a big accelerant. But essentially, anything you say in one country, can and will be used against you in another country. And I think what you need to do, and I think politicians need to understand, they need to play, a chess, a three-dimensional chess, where they're talking to the EU and presenting the argument for why they're doing something. At the same time, they need to defend it to their national audience, and they need to find a way to manage those. Somehow, there's some elements of contradiction sometimes, and I think that's what they need to be able to do if they want to, not blow up kind of one of the relationships in doing that. And I think Brexit is the extreme example where the constant negative communication has damaged even the willingness to negotiate. I think that, as you said, there's probably quite a lot of common ground on things that make sense to be done. But if you're constantly talking to a British Tory audience, it just you can't get a proper negotiation. And I think getting to become much better communicators is one of the things that policymakers need to develop as a skill, and they need to understand that that means having a message that you can adapt to an EU audience, to a national audience, and that it will travel across different channels and it will morph around those different channels. And you need to keep an eye on that, and you need to manage that process as much as possible. And I'm not saying it's easy. I think it's a big challenge, but ignoring it is what creates the most damage.
Absolutely. So with that, I think we can conclude. So thank you very much, Philip Weiss of ZN Consulting.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
The Brussels Report podcast.